Thank you very much. I'm still reeling, and some of the images that you implanted in me. Maybe this is superficial, I don't know. You talked about in your illustrations, or your couples, your families, had a male and a female. I don't imagine it would be limited to that, but two people. And it made me wonder a couple of things. One, do single people ever do this? Have you looked into that as well? And also, even more sort of basic to me, I found myself thinking, is this something that a couple would do kind of on their own, or are there communities that support this way of life? And what difference does that make?
Those are great questions, not at all superficial. One thing I definitely learned early on in interviewing these people is that if you want to become this kind of do-gooder, it is really, really important that you marry the right person. Because if you marry the wrong person, it's really not going to work. That said, one of the people I wrote about, who I didn't tell you about tonight, a man who's an animal rights activist, did not have children on purpose to avoid this kind of conflict. I don't think he really wanted children anyway, but he was very well aware that that would be a lifelong conflict if he did. And he ended up in a happy partnership with a woman, but he thought that he was going to be alone because he thought he was too weird to live with someone. I mean, he's sort of similar to Julia in the sense that he started out with a very, very, very stringent sense of what he would allow himself, and he thought, who is going to put up with this? This is, he realizes he's very unusual. And Julia, too, thought she was likely always going to be alone. And it was just great luck that they both found people who are willing to go on that journey with them. But I think in principle, there's no reason a single person could not pursue this on their own. And they didn't come from communities. I think there certainly are communities that foster altruistic behavior, but I chose these people in part because they did not come from those communities, because I wanted to look at that kind of strong moral drive that would overcome even the sense among people around them that what they were doing was not only bizarre, but maybe not even right. Certainly the Badeaus, the people who adopted all those kids, have encountered tons of criticism. People who think they're pathological, that they need to adopt more and more kids. Like some people are addicted to shopping. They just want more and more kids, which is just not the case. And people thought they were presumptuous to imagine that they could be good parents to so many kids. And they did it anyway. And I think I wholeheartedly admire them, but I do understand why people have conflicted feelings about what they did and whether it was the right thing to do. Does anyone else have a question?
You did not bring to our attention or to your presentation religion, and how does that play in setting up the code morals that some others might not consider moral, and how are these people very religious or not so religious, or can you expand on the religious concept?
Yeah, I was very interested in what difference religion made, and some of the people I wrote about are religious and some are not. The adopting couple, Hector and Sue, are devout Christians. They're not fundamentalist-style Christians. God is very important to everything they do, but if you go to their house, it's decorated with all kinds of, their kids come from many different backgrounds and they want to celebrate that. So there are decorations for Eid and decorations for Diwali and decorations for Passover and decorations for, all kinds of different holidays. And so they're definitely religious, but of a certain kind. I think one of the differences it makes, someone pointed this out to me, a United Methodist pastor that I wrote about pointed this out to me. She said, religious and not religious people can feel an equally strong sense of duty, but it has a different quality, because someone who believes who has faith in God believes that even though we may struggle on earth, ultimately fixing the world is God's business. It's up to him. And that doesn't relieve you of any obligation to work as hard as you can to try to make the world better, but it's not ultimately going to depend on you. And you aren't responsible, and you can't understand why the world is as it is. Whereas somebody who does not believe in God believes that we're alone here. It's just us, and it's no one's, if you don't do it, and your fellow humans don't do it and try to fix the world, no one else is going to. And I think that does add a layer of urgency and perhaps despair to the moral drive of people who don't believe. I think there's also, I mean, this is something I don't know much about at all, so I hesitate even to mention it, but there is a difference by tradition in the way that different religions regard such people as I've talked to you about tonight. In, for instance, Christianity and Buddhism and Hinduism, there's a lot of space for the kind of person who may leave his family behind in order to pursue a moral or spiritual goal. Someone who is very ascetic, and the Buddha left his family behind to achieve enlightenment, and that was sort of essential to it. Whereas Judaism and Islam, Moses did not leave his family behind, neither did Muhammad. There's a sense, at least, of course, all of these religions have multiple traditions, but there's a point at which, and one of the early believers in Islam, for instance, he's a very rich man, and he has only one daughter, and he asks Muhammad, I have only one daughter, I have more money than she needs, should I give most of it away to charity and when I die? And Muhammad says, no, you can give, I can't remember the exact percentages, but you should give a very substantial portion to your daughter, because it's your first responsibility to make sure that your family does not fall into poverty, and then you can take care of strangers. And similarly in Judaism, you're required to give away 10%, but it's almost forbidden to give away too much, more than 20 or 30%, because, again, it's thought to be a person's first responsibility to take care of their family, and only after that is well secured do you pay attention and take care of strangers. And I think that's a very interesting difference in these world religions, because I think, on a superficial reading, we think, well, all religions promote charity, and that's perfectly true. They all do, but there is a difference in where they draw the line between family and strangers.
Hi.
Hi.
Forgetting what I wanted to ask you. Feeling nervous. I volunteer 1 hour a week up in Seattle with homeless women. I just hand out clothing. And I started doing it because I needed a new perspective on my life. And I realized that I had a lot of love to share that I wasn't able to share with everybody around me because they'd think I was weird. And I just bring basically a presence to the room when they're there, and I don't expect anything back. And I was wondering if any of the people you interviewed talked about love and the heart, because for me that's what it's about. And I also wanted to mention that I come from an alcoholic family, and the whole idea of perfectionism is a big deal, and it's wrecked my life. But this volunteering has changed the need to fix, but just instead be a presence. So I'm just wondering if the heart was discussed at all.
Thank you for telling us that, and absolutely. I mean, in different ways for each of these people, because the people I wrote about are very different from one another, except in the basic sense of having a very strong moral drive. They did all have that sense of perfectionism, which as I alluded to, this theory of the parentified child does seem to be something that sometimes emerges from alcoholic homes, the drive to be the perfect child, the perfect person to help as many people as possible. And I think what you describe, this sort of shifting from I must fix people, I must change their lives, to it's fine just to be here and lend a presence of an evening, I think is a very important one, and one that was difficult for each one of the people I wrote about to achieve. Absolutely, love is important to all of them. Though, it's striking. Many of them express their love in a direct way, like you're describing, in direct service through, one of them is a nurse. Obviously, Sue and Hector are parents, expressing love to their children. And many people I've spoken to, I don't know, I have no way of knowing what your reaction is, but many people I've spoken to about Julia and Jeff, the ones whose primary work is giving away money, are repelled by that. And they think it is lower than helping someone in a direct human fashion. And I want to defend them, because I think even that which is admittedly abstract and distant, they're helping people they will never meet and never know directly. It's a very humble kind of giving, because they know, well, I could help someone directly, but if by giving money I enable 4 people to perform that role, then that's better. And it's not about me and about my feeling of happiness that I'm helping someone. It's about the importance of someone being helped. And I think one of the things that enables them to feel morally satisfied in that life is, and this is something all the people I wrote about have in common, it's a kind of aesthetic gift. It's a vividness of imagination. I think most of us, in order to feel a sense of moral urgency, need something very visceral right in front of our faces, either someone the homeless person in the same room, or a photograph often performs this role. So the obvious example is the photograph of that toddler who drowned off the coast of Greece last year that everyone in the world saw, and temporarily for 5, 10, 15 minutes felt really bad about the toddler and was maybe moved to donate to a relevant charity, and then went about their life. And one of the striking things about people I wrote about is that they have a vividness of imagination that allows them to conjure up from abstract statistics the sense of people drowning or suffering like that. They don't need the photograph. They think about it all the time. And this can be disabling. I mean, imagine having that photograph in front of you all the time. It's not easy to deal with, but it drives them forward. And so it means that someone like Julia, who is donating money, is not just donating it in a totally abstract way, but she can imagine the kinds of problems that she's helping to alleviate by donating it. Hi.
Hi. Thanks for your talk, and thank you for bucking the trend yourself by looking into this topic when you mentioned that it's not something that normally gets that much light and exposure. What I found interesting is that in your descriptions of the examples that you gave, it seems like a lot of the people were born with it. It was something innate. So to give myself a sense of hope, and maybe for society, is this something that can be taught? Or does that have to be something you're born with?
I don't think any of them, I'm not a biologist or neuroscientist, I don't know, but I don't think any of them were born with it, like as in came out of the womb with this sense of moral duty. Certainly, I think all of them, well, no, not even all of them. I was going to say all of them felt this drive in childhood. I think most of them, I think most of us when we're growing up, we receive 2 messages from our parents, or not most of us, but many of us. There's the explicit message, which is you should help others and be kind and be good to other people. And then there's the implicit message, which is don't worry about that. Just succeed. Just go get it. Just do the best you can for yourself. And I think one of the striking things about the people I wrote about is that they heard the explicit message and they didn't hear the implicit message. They kept, to a simple, which is not to say childlike or simplistic, moral sense that many of us have when we're very little, and they just never lost it. It kept on making sense to them. But not everyone even felt that way in childhood, and not everyone had the same kind of emotional relationship to their sense of duty. So Jeff, Julia's husband, it was incredibly lucky that she found him, but it wasn't because he was the same as her, not at all. She grew up with this very burdensome, until she figured out a system to deal with it, burdensome sense of morality, a sense of guilt that she could never do enough, that she always had to do more. He had none of that. He was simply by nature incredibly thrifty, and he just saved money because he didn't feel like spending it, and so she comes along, she's like, I have something to do with that money of yours, I can help you spend it. But he completely agrees with her now about what he's morally obliged to do, but it's not an emotional thing for him. For him, it's pure logic, and there's a movement that's flourishing on several college campuses and elsewhere called the effective altruist movement. You're nodding, you know what I mean. Inspired in large part by the ideas of the philosopher Peter Singer. And many of the members of this movement, although they feel obliged to give a great deal to others, often 50, 60% of what they earn, in many cases it's not an emotional thing, it's not a thing that they were born with, it's not something that came out of childhood, it's about sheer logic. They are persuaded that, I am no more important than anyone else. I am living in a first world country and have a huge amount. Other people are living in desperate circumstances and have almost nothing. That's unfair. Therefore, it is obligatory for me to do something to alleviate that unfairness. And it's almost like an algorithm for them. And that's how it was for Jeff. Jeff is completely convinced of this algorithm and is totally committed as Julia is, to their joint project. But there wasn't anything innate about it. Hi.
So my question is, so in studying and addressing altruism beginnings, and how do you feel about families that deal with like the cultural norm that have that pragmatic sense of helping somebody and finding that practical solution, and how they fit in that social competition against like a regular the American dream sort of family?
Well, all the people I wrote about are pretty pragmatic, but in terms of competing against more ordinary career goals, they don't. I mean, But as I was trying, that's sort of what I was trying to say at the end. That for them, this is just as fulfilling a career as any other, probably more so. They don't have much money, and they don't have the obvious luxuries and comforts, but I think they have something that makes them happier than most people are made by those luxuries and comforts. And it's interesting you bring this up, because, I mean, this is another quality. There are a number of extra-moral qualities, in the sense of not strictly moral qualities, that they need to possess in order to make a life like this work. One of them, I think, is the aesthetic ability, the vividness of imagination that I mentioned earlier, but also it's just a pig-headedness. I mean, these people just don't care what anyone else thinks, and that is essential, because, as I said, people think they're weird. People think, at best, people think they're weird. At worst, people think they're kind of inhuman and unnatural to be always chasing after strangers in the way that they do. And so they just have to resolve not to care about that. And that's really, really hard. And that may be one of the rarest qualities of all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Larissa, let's take two more questions,
Okay.
and then we'll move to the book signing.
Okay.
Thank you, Larissa. If empathy was a consciously taught component in early education, primary, secondary, so forth, would that change the dynamics of altruism? And I think of just teaching humane education, where you take an example into a classroom and say, how do you think this little dog feels?
Mm-hmm.
Is he thirsty? Does he want to eat, sleep, be warm? And have that as a built into the core curricula, or don't use that, into curricula.
Into schools, right.
So that eventually it just becomes a conscious thought. The universal golden rule is something that we understand all around the world. It's really not a religious tenet.
Right.
It's how do you feel? How would they feel? And I wonder if that could be embedded into education in addition to parents modeling empathy. Would that change things?
I mean, the most obvious answer is I don't know. But, you know, certainly empathy is very, very important to many moral acts. But it's interesting that you should bring that up, because I just read a book which is going to come out in a month or two, sometime soon, by a psychologist at Yale called Paul Bloom. And it's called Against Empathy. And the subhead is The Case for Rational Compassion. And the argument he makes is very interesting, because, you know, he's well aware that we all think empathy is the root of morality, or at least one important root of morality. And he argues that empathy, the problem with empathy is that it is not fair, that people feel more empathy for people like them, for people right in front of them, rather than distant people who may need help more. Empathy can be, at best, biased, and at worst, actually bigoted. And he argues against empathy because he thinks that it may lead to moral actions, but they may not be the best moral actions. So, for instance, when there's a disaster, a natural disaster like the tsunami or an earthquake, people are moved to hell, or a shooting even. People are, their empathy is aroused. They imagine how those people must feel, especially if they're people kind of like them, and they donate tons of money. But in fact, donating money to disaster relief is one of the least effective ways to help. That donating to charities that deal with chronic poverty tends to make much more of a difference. But because empathy is not aroused by the sort of faceless chronic poverty that as an immediate event that activates your sort of empathetic response, people tend to donate to it less. And sometimes, you know, this can lead to things that don't help at all. Like after the shooting, the school shooting in Connecticut, people were horrified by it and moved by empathy. They thought, what can we do? And they donated hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of stuffed animals. And this town, which was actually a fairly wealthy town, was overwhelmed with like warehouses full of stuffed animals. And it was driven by a good feeling, like a feeling of horror at what these people had gone through and a desire to help them. But because it was a kind of spontaneous emotional response rather than a kind of colder, rational response, it produced a result that wasn't actually helpful. So I think you should read this book. It's a really, really interesting argument. He's not against all kinds of empathy. He's against a kind of immediate emotional feeling with somebody, the kind of response that if you see someone crying, you cry also or feel like crying yourself, as opposed to, and you can see how that kind of response, even in a face-to-face situation, might not be the most helpful one, because if you are crying yourself, then there's now two of you that need help. And whereas the person crying may not want you to cry with them, they may sometimes, but sometimes they may want you to stay calm and tell them, you know, to take charge of the situation or think of something to do that they are currently too distressed to think of. So I encourage all of you to read the book. It's very interesting because I think there is an assumption that empathy is what we need more of. And it's just very, very interesting to read an argument where he says, no, there should be less empathy. Can you please repeat the title? It's called Against Empathy by Paul Bloom. And it's not out yet, but I'm sure you can pre-order it. It's going to be out in the next few months.
So I was wondering if, in talking to some of these do-gooders or researching them, if you found differences in how they're defining who the stranger is. And throughout your talk, I was thinking about Sebastian Junger's latest book, Tribe, which I would imagine you've read. And his...
Not yet. My husband has got it, and I'm trying to get it away from him, but I haven't managed to yet.
So a similar set of questions, but more a critique of our culture and the question of why people returning from war seem to miss it because of this sense of connection they have with their unit and their fellow soldiers. But in any case, just because they're in so many different cultures, so many different layers of relationship beyond just family, stranger, and how some of the people you talk to or researched tried to account for trying to have this vision of who the stranger is.
You know, that's a great question, and it could be the subject for 20 more books. And I think, of course, it depends on the person. I mean, I think some people have a very strong sense of community in the sense of people who live in their neighborhood or in their town. I was just reporting a piece in West Virginia, and there, in part because there are very few people who move to. I was based in a town called Logan in southern West Virginia. Very few people move there, and the people who are there can often trace their family histories in that one little town back 150 years, and they know everybody. They've grown up with everybody in the town, and what they described to me is a sense of, they said, oh, we're very family-oriented, and at first when they said that, I thought, well, everyone's family-oriented, that doesn't mean anything, what are you talking about? And then as they explained it to me, I realized, oh, what they mean by family is actually the opposite of what I mean by family. What they meant was their neighborhood. And they said they felt obliged to help their neighbor if their neighbor was in trouble in exactly the same way as they would feel obliged to help their brother. And this is not about, a superior moral code. It's just that that's their circle of obligation. If our brother was in trouble, we would feel obliged to help him. We wouldn't feel like all morally superior for doing so. It's just what we have to do. We want to, but also there's no question. And for them, that was a larger circle. And I think it really depends on what kind of community you grow up in, whether you feel that or not. I think many people, I live in New York City. I don't know many of my neighbors. I've only lived there part of my life. I may live somewhere else next year, who knows? And so it's a very different relationship to one's community. And, I don't know if that's responsible for instincts, moral instincts. One thing I was very struck by, a few years ago, there was a book called The Power of Half, about a family in Atlanta whose 14-year-old daughter said, we should sell our house so we can give half the money away to charity, and they did. The parents actually did this. They sold their house, and they bought a house that was half as expensive, and they gave away the proceeds to, I think it was a housing charity in Ghana. And they wrote a book about it called The Power of Half, and there were articles about this, and I read the comments on the articles, and it was amazing to me. Some of them said, how great, what a wonderful thing you did, but very few. Many, many more people said, this is disgusting. How could you even think about giving this money away to people in Ghana when there are people suffering right here in the United States? How could you? What are you thinking about? Take care of your own community first. And I found this very startling. And I was talking about this at one point with Jeff and Julia, and Jeff said, people have said that to me too, because they mostly donate to charities abroad because they get more bang for the buck. People are in more desperate need, and a dollar donated goes farther in other countries than it does here. And he said, why should a stranger in Malawi be any more of a stranger to me than a stranger who lives in the next town over in Boston? I don't know either of them, and I've never met them, and I'm never likely to. And they felt to him equally strangers, but for the people I was talking to in West Virginia, that would have made no sense at all. So I think it really depends in part on how rooted you are in the place you grow up, how much of a distinction you draw between family, community, and stranger, and who belongs in which layer.
Okay, well, I really want to thank Larissa MacFarquhar for her presentation. I want to thank all of you.
Thank you.
You can read Larissa's article on her visit to West Virginia in the current issue that's just coming out in the New Yorker magazine this week. It's the one with the cover of Donald Trump in a bathing suit that Francois Mouly, who's going to be here February 17th, is the art editor at the New Yorker. So there's a connection. So look for that. We are going to do a book signing right now up here on the stage. I want to thank all of you for coming. You've been a great audience. I really want to thank Larissa for a terrific presentation.